Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I will try my best to stick to the time limit. Some confirmation, is the screen being flashed properly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. It's actually a very good trajectory for our presentations, especially the previous presentation on the post-truth situation. I think right now, I want to sort of focus on in my presentation among the real world implications of new media, of disinformation in particular. In a way, it's stepping back from some of the details of our work against disinformation, but I think it's also quite important to put actually things into a larger perspective. It's of course very frustrating to not be faced with facts. It is very frustrating that the publics, our constituents, seem to be more motivated by emotions, stories, narratives, but it is a reality we have to work with. And I want to share the Philippine experience because hopefully it won't happen in other countries. But unfortunately, I do think it is happening in various degrees in other countries as well. I have a actually very straightforward presentation. It's trying to connect some key threads from the discussions, well, yesterday and especially today. The question of disinformation, bring it up to the question of anti-democratic systems, and then one of the specific implications of an anti-democratic system, as expressed in the Philippines, militarism. So the basic thread of the argument is that in the Philippines, we are fundamentally still and essentially anti-democratic. We have the forms in appearance of democracy, supposed free press, supposed free elections. We don't have an open dictatorship. But I think the fact that for decades now we have very seriously anti-democratic outcomes does actually go to show how, I think that's why the last presentation was quite useful, how even the forms of democracy don't deliver either the democratic processes we want, but much more the democratic outcomes we want. So from that context, of course, social media, the new media, technology, digital technology, these are just tools. But unfortunately, in practice, they have been tools that have not been democratizing. I still remember the 1990s. There's a lot of talk about the internet being democratizing in so many levels. But in the particular case of the Philippines, I want to sort of take up how, among other anti-democratic practices and tools that political elites have, the current Marcos Jr. administration, which came into power in June 2022, after May elections, among the tools it used, unfortunately quite well, quite skillfully, is digital media and disinformation to rise to power. So that's a clear connection between the disinformation practices, the new media, leading to some very particular anti-democratic outcome, the kind of government we have. And then among its policy choices, unfortunately, its foreign policy choice is to support militarism, not just in the country, but in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and essentially, we argue, the rest of the Indo-Pacific region. It's a very straightforward presentation. I have 3 slides on each of these points. Our anti-democratic system, disinformation as not just a tool for creating that anti-democratic system, but also the result of that system, and with a little bit of a focus on the militarist foreign policy. I do want to stress that the Philippines, again, appearances notwithstanding, the free elections, the free press, no open dictatorship, it is still a fundamentally anti-democratic system. And I think that it's quite important to look at the current administration in the context of the last administration, which was more openly populist and authoritarian. But this current administration, again, appearances notwithstanding, and in truth, despite pretensions to liberal democracy and speaking the democratic rhetoric, being quite keen on using current global issues, the Marcos Jr., the son of the dictator, the electoral victory of the Marcos Jr. camp was in alliance with the daughter of the former President Duterte, and it is on all levels a triumph of very anti-democratic politics, although despite being a result of the elections, taking the electoral route. The Marcos Jr.'s family, the Marcos family's DNA, actually represents a lot of the worst aspects of Philippine politics. It is a dynastic family. At least 23 family members have gone in and out of politics over the last 30 years. That is a very clear expression of how in the Philippines, very strikingly, since independence, 90% of Philippine presidents, 80% of provincial governors, 60% of senators, over half of mayors, and over half of representatives in the House of Representatives in Congress, they come from just 200 to about 250 families. And I think that's a very striking example of, in a population of 115 million, more or less, I think by next year, that's about 26 million Filipino families. It doesn't make sense that local politics and national politics is dominated by just a handful of families. And again, as an expression of that dynastic family politics in the Philippines, the current Marcos family is pretty much an example of that. Secondly, corruption is quite deep-rooted in the Philippines. Of course, the maintenance of the dynastic family power by the Marcoses is financed by the world-class corruption, mainly, quite prominently by the Marcos dictatorship, allegedly stealing $5 to $10 billion in 1986 dollars. By our computations, that would be at least $15 to $20 billion right now, on a conservative 6% return on investment through all those decades. So it is a family that has maintained its political power on the back of world-class corruption. Apart from the political alliance it built up to take victory in the June 2022 elections, in the May 2022 elections, was an alignment with three of the most corrupt presidents of the last 36 years. Two of whom are convicted, former Presidents Estrada and Arroyo, who did serve a little bit of jail time, and of course, soon to be convicted, we hope, especially by the ICC, former President Duterte. So again, an expression of the corrupt political system. Third, also representing a long legacy of dictatorship, authoritarianism in the country. Apart from being the son of a dictator, apart from profiting and maintaining political power from the fruits of that dictatorship, the stolen fruits of that dictatorship, it was an alliance with two of the most violent presidents in the post-dictatorship history, former President Arroyo and former President Duterte. And of course, the last point for the anti-democratic aspect is the disinformation and deceit, which will be a big part of this seminar and this presentation. I won't go into the last part in much detail, but I think it's quite well known. The Philippines remains a very deeply unequal economy with very, very deep and very, very widespread poverty. Even the World Bank, long a cheerleader of Philippine economics, because we're quite a big fan of neoliberal economics, our administrations. It was forced to admit just last year the Philippines has one of the most unequal economies in East Asia, with about 30 countries of East Asia. Some key indicators, so many more can be said, of course, but some key indicators. The richest 2% of the population have a wealth larger than the poorest 80% combined. And amid such huge wealth, we have a dozen of our billionaires are on the top 300 billionaires in the world. 70% of families, of 26 million families, don't have any savings. Not just savings in the bank, no savings under their mattress or in their closet. 70% of families have no savings, and not using underestimated government estimates of poverty. Self-rated poverty is at about 82%. Self-rated poor and also borderline poor. So that corresponds quite well with the figure of 70% of families being poor. So it's an anti-democratic system. The anti-democratic system has an elite on the top of that system, and they have used disinformation on a massive scale. The Philippines, I think quite famously, by I forget his or her name, a former Facebook executive, after observing our 2016 elections, I think this was before Trump's time, named the Philippines as patient zero in the global misinformation epidemic. So that was, had a bit of foresight, even before pandemic and public health concerns was high in people's minds. The Philippines was called by Facebook, ironically, patient zero in the global misinformation epidemic because of how the former President Duterte used social media and disinformation to rise to power. And I think that's quite what I think is quite useful to share with this body. With the Philippines, coming from an anti-democratic system, the democratizing potential of social media, not only did it not manifest, it actually resulted in very adverse electoral outcomes in 2016 and in 2022. We are fond of calling the 2010 elections, we have elections every 6 years, national elections. We are fond of calling 2010 elections as the last year that mass media mattered. In the 2016 elections, and of course 2022, and elections, it seems, for the coming decades to come, as social media-driven elections. The last president, Duterte, and the current president, Marcos, very shrewdly used social media to bring themselves to power. Unfortunately, that was a very self-serving use of digital technologies. Already in itself, the most expansive and systematic mind conditioning apparatus I think the world has ever seen, but also in the Philippine case, the most expansive and systematic election conditioning apparatus that the country has ever seen. The Philippines, unfortunately, is quite vulnerable to that because by last count, in our population of 112 or 115, I think in a couple of years, 94 million, over 80%, over 8 out of 10 Filipinos are on social media. And the youth especially, over 40% of internet users are youth underneath 34 years old, spending, I think, 4 to 5 hours a day on one social media outlet or the other. Of internet users, Facebook is the biggest. 90 to 95% of Philippine internet users use Facebook. About 75 to 80% use Instagram. About 60% use TikTok. There was a news item a couple of months ago reporting the Philippines as having among the biggest TikTok users in the world. Now, this social media presence and usage was used very craftily by the previous government, previous administration, Duterte, and Marcos to promote themselves. Again, images contrary to the facts. President Duterte, despite his violent drug war, even in the city of Davao, where he used to be mayor, was able to project Davao City as a utopia, crime-free, prosperous, safe for everyone, except for drugs, for drug users. He also was able to twist his violent streak, his brashness, his uncouthness, to just, it was tough fatherly concern. If he does something excessive, it's out of love, it's out of concern, not out of any sort of malice. And that sort of image building. And that was, I think, the main thing that drove the Facebook executive to call the Philippines patient zero in disinformation, because President Duterte did win with a comfortable mandate in 2016. President Marcos arguably has even more baggage than the former mayor because of his father, dictator Marcos, human rights violations, grand theft. Also his family, dynastic, accused of corruption, not returning any of the money stolen by the father. But very deftly, the current president was able to somehow twist the nightmare economic years, the nightmare civil and political liberties, rights violations years of the dictatorship as somehow being the golden years for the Philippines. And correcting that, again, completely against the facts, but creating this impression that things were fantastic in the 1970s, early 1980s, because of the extreme crisis in the Philippines right now, that seemed to be enough to be the core of an incredible 60% mandate, voters mandate, the biggest in the post-dictatorship era in the last 40 years, and the third biggest in Philippine history. So completely against the facts, but completely molding the perception of people about that. I wanted to give some stress on the elections because elections are, of course, important on their own terms. They determine who holds political power. But we also view elections as important barometers of public political involvement. The periodic elections are the most concentrated expression of political engagement. But outside of that, how people view daily life, how people view daily politics, I think is also formed, unfortunately, by social media. And then, finding their peak of manipulation only around election time, but also happening before the elections, during the elections, but also after. So the fact that the ideas and narratives and minds of people are shaped so fundamentally, one expression of that is the rise of populist authoritarian rule in the Philippines. But another expression actually is, it actually does sort of diminish public participation in politics. There is, of course, the obvious impact on individuals of direct disinformation, misinformation. Individuals are disinformed and misinformed. But on the larger scale, we're also, of course, seeing how even the foundation of some kind of democratic consensus, some sort of unity around facts, not unity around perception, that fragmentation has worsened. It's this even a point beyond any sort of simple matter of polarization. We have observed that the swarm of so much inconsistent, often contradictory information, even if people don't believe the information floating around, it is enough actually to stoke distrust of source information. It's enough to create an impression that facts don't matter anymore, things are relative. And the bottom line, instead of actually getting public consensus based on facts, this doesn't have to be everyone, but instead of getting a majority consensus based on facts, we are building a distrustful public, which is a very poor foundation for democratic societies. Also, one very specific malicious use of the social media, new media, in the last administration was in terms of discouraging dissent and criticism by attacking critics. Critics were vilified. It started from like some small cyberbullying, but it emerged that there was a state-sponsored campaign to vilify any critics of the administration, colloquially in the Philippines, but also I think embraced by the United Nations in their reports about rights violations. It's called red tagging. Red tagging is basically any critic is criticized to have links with the terrorist labeled Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army. And in a lot of ways that has served to intimidate people not to speak out. It has closed civic space. It is actually, in the worst cases, created the grounds for violent attacks on activists and on civil society. And the net result is, because of that sustained vilification of critics, in the worst instances, our Miss Universe contestants and actresses have been accused of being terrorist supporters. The end result is to stifle critical voices. And of course, putting that together, the disinformation goes beyond problems of individuals. It fragments the public, but also silences and inhibits people from becoming more critical of the current government, which of course is the enabling conditions for centralized populist authoritarian rule. One specific example, we think that we draw a direct connection from disinformation to real-world outcomes, is how the current administration, once it became to power, it actually quickly realigned with U.S. militarism. Of course, no government will ever declare dependent foreign policy, but the pivot in the Philippines has been from the previous administration leaning towards China, giving sway to Chinese militarism in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. It's shifted to supporting the militarism of the United States. And it was actually quite surprising, even for many mainstream observers in the Philippines, that quick shift and coming on board to the U.S. agenda to expand its military presence, not just in the Philippines, but across the whole stretch of the Indo-Pacific, from India, in the subcontinent, all the way up to East Asia. I just sort of listed here some sort of key points about how the Philippines serves that role. The Philippines was identified as one of four force posture countries by the United States. Guam, Japan, and Australia, and the Philippines were identified as areas to deploy U.S. troops. But fast forward to that, in just a few months, the Marcos administration actually supported expansion of U.S. bases in the country from an existing 5 sites to now 9 sites. That's on top of some side contracts between the private contractors, U.S. military contractors running the former Hanjin facilities, having contracts to work with the Philippine Navy to enable the U.S. military ships to have safe harbor in the country. That's on top of long-standing agreements that the former administration threatened to cut, but now not only have these agreements been consolidated, They've actually been raised to a higher level with the issuance of new bilateral defense guidelines, greatly expanding the scope and of military intervention with the Philippine Armed Forces. So this is sort of, I think, one example of how the administration, which has used disinformation to come into power, among other anti-democratic practices, it is quite an unprincipled administration out of the interest in a lot of ways to rehabilitate the family name. It converges with the need of the United States to actually have an outpost, a military outpost in the Philippines. So that's just one of the most prominent expressions of the shift in the security realm. I want to conclude with some of the ways we are trying to tackle these urgent issues. The three main lines, of course, are we want democratic development versus ruling elites. We want facts and information versus self-serving political deceit to be the base of our electoral democracy. We also want a truly independent foreign policy, upholding peace instead of militarism, sovereignty instead of aggression. We want the national interest to be defined not in terms of force, but in terms of diplomacy. Just some, a few more seconds, if you will give it to me. In terms of combating anti-democratic elites, we do want to keep exposing elitist politics and economics, but beyond elections, we want to strengthen economic struggles on the ground, stoking criticism, stoking organized groups to struggle for their legitimate economic demands. That's in the frame of a larger grassroots-based democracy. And I think one of the positive things happening in the Philippines right now, we have had a long history of various threads of activism. The threat now is almost existential, so much wider alliances of democratic and progressive forces are being built. In terms of combating disinformation, I love the app. I tried using actually the app earlier to check disinformation. We, of course, do want sustained education awareness raising on issues among our constituents, including against disinformation, but we have not given up on using responsible mass media outlets. We still do believe in press freedom. We still do think there are some vital audiences that mass media reaches. So we want to sort of support that, again, as mentioned by the previous presenter, because there are mechanisms in place to check facts, at least in responsible mass media outlets. At the same time, we do know it is important to always learn how to maximize social media, not to be caught up in spreading lies just to get your political stand across, but of course, using social media in a responsible manner. In particular, we have pushed back against state-sponsored disinformation. We filed cases against state agents, security forces, public spokespersons for their disinformation. But we're also continuously interacting with Facebook and Twitter for them to behave more responsibly. Specifically in combating militarism, of course, part of the things we want to sort of put across to the general public is a more genuine independent foreign policy. We do believe it is possible to push for more non-alignment, not just within the country, but even regionally among the countries, at least to check the militarism of the United States, which unfortunately remains to dominate U.S. foreign policy. That's it. I apologize for going a bit over time. Thank you.